Hello, friends. My name's Carissa, and I'm an alcoholic. My journey with alcoholism started way before I entered the rooms of AA. I was brought up in an alcoholic family. My father was an alcoholic, just like his father before him. My families on both sides were both alcoholics. My dad's side particularly chronic, coupled with mental illness. And on mum's side, the alcoholism were what you'd call probably the high bottom drunks. Dad's side were the low bottom drunks. And I unfortunately became a very low bottom drunk. I started drinking very early on in age because there was always alcohol in the house, and we had easy access to it because my dad was always drunk, and there were always bottles, long necks of bottles of Southwark underneath the couch and bottles of sherry next to the fridge, bottles of half-empty scotch on the kitchen table. So I was able to drink alcohol. I drank alcohol before I started school. And I remember as a young child having, Dad coming home from work on a Friday night, charged up, and he would give both my brother and I beer in our own little special beer cups. And this was before I even started school. And we thought that was normal. And I grew up in a small country town, so alcohol was a big part of the culture back in the 70s. We went to the pub a lot with other families in the town, and all of us kids used to run around the back of the hotel and run amok with, no shoes on, just running crazy until our mums were looking for us to go home. And that was back in the days when only the men were allowed in the front bar and the women were allowed to sit in the side bar, which was called the saloon bar, and or the eating area, the restaurant area, whatever you call the dining room, they used to call it. And there was often a kid asleep underneath the table on a chair. My parents used to bring me to the pub in my bouncingette, and the publican used to fill up my baby bottle with raspberry cordial when I was less than a year old. No wonder I was crazy. But my problems with alcohol began when I was a teenager, and I didn't drink like normal kids drank, but then I hung out with kids that drank like me, and that felt normal. So we all drank to get drunk. We took other substances as well, but, I ended up going out with the local drug dealer, and whenever we drank to get drunk, and it was always a disaster. And it's a wonder more of us didn't die because we were, being from the country, we drove everywhere. We'd drive out to the scrub, we'd drive to the next small town, we'd drive to somebody's house that was 15 k's out of the town, to continue the party after the pub had shut, sort of thing. So my drinking was problematic back then, and I didn't realise it. And I spent, from the age of 17, the next 20 years working in hospitality. And the first time I realised that I had an issue with alcohol was after I'd had 2 children when I was quite young, and the marriage had broken up. I was married and divorced with 2 kids, had bought and sold a house by the time I was 27. And I remember being at work, and it was about 4:45. I was about to knock off, and I was filling up the cordial bottles, and I remember my hands were shaking, and I thought, that's weird. Why have I got the shakes? It was I couldn't work it out. I just could not understand why I felt like that. And I'd had anxiety and always felt, different and I didn't fit in, that sort of thing. But I didn't realise that because of the extent of my drinking that it had turned, I'd turned into, my body was requesting alcohol to just be normal. And as soon as I had that drink at 5 o'clock when I knocked off, the shakes went away. And then I thought, wow, this does it for me. And for me, because I was always an anxious kid and, I didn't fit in and I've always felt different and I had trouble with friends, because I always wanted a friend that was like me, and there weren't really any kids like me. I found I couldn't connect with other kids that had dads at home that belted them up, or that their mums weren't coming to school with black eyes, and your home life wasn't unsafe like mine. So I didn't have anyone to talk to about that sort of stuff. So I always wanted to be somebody else. I wished that I was at someone else's house. So I'd often go to other kids' houses just to hang around with them or be in their family. A couple of kids, I used to wish that their parents were my parents, and I had this morbid thoughts of, when my parents went travelling, when they sort of started travelling and going overseas when I was about 15 when they first started travelling. My dad was still drinking at the time, and I remember he used to say to Mum, well, what happens if something happens to you? And she said, your godparents will take you. And I'm like, and my godparents were my auntie, and then she had my cousins, and she was my favourite auntie. And I used to wish that their plane would crash so that I could go and live with my auntie, because I just wanted to be in a normal house. And that's horrible because, I loved my parents, but I hated what they did. My mum was full of empty promises of leaving Dad and we were going to start a new life, because my mum wasn't a drinker, but she never followed through on anything, and she put up with it, and she let it happen. She let those things happen to us, and I always got in trouble because I was the girl. And when I was born, my dad said, we don't want any more of them. I want boys from now on, and just things like that, things I shouldn't have been told, things that should have been kept to, Mum should have not told me. And I remember my year 12 graduation, I came home, I'd been at the hairdressers, I came home and I walked in the door, and my dad was drunk, sitting at the kitchen table with half a bottle of scotch. And he told me that day when I walked in the door, he goes, he had a snarl, he was a nasty drunk, and he said, I wish you'd never been born. And I just said to Mum, I said, I don't want him coming to my graduation tonight. And Mum just said, yep, that's fine. And I was surprised because I thought she would say, no, he's your father, he has to come. But she let it go, and my boyfriend ended up coming with me. And, there were other times when Dad was quite violent when I was in my mid to late teens, and I thought Dad had shot Mum one night because he had shotguns and he had them hanging on the wall in the house. And I heard a sound. He'd come home drunk, and I'd heard this sound, and it sounded like a gun going off, and I was convinced that he'd shot Mum. And I climbed out of my bedroom window, and I went to run down to my boyfriend's house, but the problem was we lived in the main street, and my boyfriend worked at the pub on one side, and I had to go past the other pub to get to his house, and I only had pajamas on. I was 16 years old or 17 years old, and I was so terrified, and I ran down to his house and I sat down on the couch, and because we never locked our doors back in those days, I sat on the couch and I just waited for him to come home. And he came home after about an hour or so and with his mate, and he's like, "Oh, what are you doing here?" I said, "I don't know, something's happened at home. I think my dad shot Mum." I was just distraught. And his friend was really beautiful to me. His friend said my dad was an alcoholic too, and he used to be really horrible to my mum because I'd never really talked about it to other people. And I stayed there. They both stayed with me all night. And, I went home in the morning and Mum was sitting at the table, so clearly she hadn't been shot. But I walked in and I was expecting to get, growled at because, I'd been out all night and I didn't come home and I, jumped out the window. But no one said a word. Nothing. And I think it was 2 years after that I left home because I just could not stand the violence. And unfortunately, due to a number of factors, my relationship with that boyfriend broke up. My mother had a lot to do with that. My dad made it clear that he didn't like him. And we were together for 4 years and the relationship broke up. So I'd moved to Adelaide and my drinking just was out of control. I also have an eating disorder, and that started around the age of 11, and that was connected to wanting attention from my father because I felt like the only time he noticed me was when something was wrong. And I'd had chicken pox and I was really sick, and he said to Mum, "There's something wrong with that kid. You need to take her to the doctors." And that was the only time I thought, "Oh, Dad's noticed me." So that was the beginning of, a long journey along the road of anorexia through my life, connected to men, basically, wanting attention from men. And it was subconscious at that time. I didn't realise until I'd been in AA for a while that that's what it was. But my drinking was out of control, and I'd ended up getting pregnant and marrying this guy that he was an alcoholic as well, and it didn't end well. He was exactly the same as my dad, and we travelled around Australia a bit, and I just wanted to come home so I could leave him. And as soon as we got home, we'd bought a house because I'd saved a lot of money, and I didn't want to leave what I'd worked for. And after 6 months, I said, "Right, that's it, get out." And he left. I think he knew it was coming. And so when he left, I was left with 2 young children, and my drinking became quite heavy. I was a daily drinker. I was drinking straight after work. I was drinking all night, a couple of bottles of wine every night. It progressed to a morning drink, carrying alcohol with me wherever I went, having alcohol stashed in the car, all those behaviours that were not normal, not what normal people did. Normal people don't have alcohol stashed in their glove box, in kids' drink bottles. They don't have it in their handbags when they go to the hairdressers. That's not normal. They don't drink it first thing in the morning to get out of bed. And it soon became apparent that I was not a functioning alcoholic. I'm a non-functioning alcoholic. And as a result, my children were removed from my care for 18 months, and I was sent to a rehab. And, I'd done detox that many times that I got banned from from Joslin. I don't know anyone else that's been banned from a detox. I know you get banned from hotels, but I was banned from detox. And I went to rehab for a couple of months, 3 months, and I got 5 months of sobriety, and I came home and I didn't really know anything about AA, and so I didn't maintain that sobriety, and inevitably I drank again. But I do remember my very first meeting, and I was 28 years old, and I didn't know what to do, and I looked through the yellow pages and I rang AA, and I said, I think I've got a problem with alcohol. And they never said to me, oh, you're an alcoholic, or you need to do this, or you need to do that. They were very kind to me, and they said to me, look, can you get to a meeting? And I said no, because I've lost my license for 5 years because I had 3 DUIs in a number of weeks, and I was looking at prison time, and they said, look, someone will come out and pick you up. And I said, oh, that'd be great. So I gave them my address, and they were going to pick me up that night. And then I hung up the phone, and I thought, what the hell have I just done? I don't even know these people. I don't know who they are. Is it a cult? Like, I didn't know anything about AA. But at the time, I was at that point that I just didn't even care. Anyway, they rocked up in this car, and I think every door was a different colour, and there was a couple of blokes in there with tattoos all over them and smoke coming out of the car. And I got out there, and I thought, I don't care if these blokes cut me up and put me in a barrel, like that Bodies in the Barrel murder case, or they take me to the meeting. I just didn't care, because I was just so done with life, with the way my drinking was going. I didn't know how to get out of it. I didn't want to live, but I didn't want to die. I just didn't know what to do. I needed to be carried. And those people did. They took me to the meeting, and a man named Hollywood Jim came out. When I got to Brompton Beginners, that was my first ever meeting, and he came out to welcome me, and he brought a book out and he gave it to me, a big book, and he said, we've been waiting for you. And I thought, Jesus Christ, I thought my bloody parents have been ringing these people too, because, they were looking for every way to get me sober. And I thought, oh God, I was so paranoid. And they gave me a book, and I thought, oh no, it's a course, it's a study, it's another degree that I've got to get. And I didn't know what to think of all of it. And I got inside, and Arthur was the guest speaker, and I had a hip flask of vodka with me, because I thought, I don't know how I'm going to get through an hour and a half without a drink. So he was the guest speaker, and all I heard that night was Root and Branch. And one Sunday in April 1965, that was the only 2 things I heard. And then at the halftime break, I went into the toilets and I sculled that flask of vodka so I could get on with the second half of the meeting. And then I came out, and I sporadically went to AA, but I didn't commit myself. I went once a week. A very nice lady used to pick me up and take me to AA once a week, but I wasn't committed. I didn't go to any other meetings. I didn't get people's numbers. I never made phone calls. I didn't do any of the suggested things. I just thought if you just went there once a week, that would be okay. You'd be all right. But it wasn't. It got worse and worse. And in the end, I'd used up all my chances. I'd done everything but AA properly. And I'm talking everything. I Googled every single thing that was wrong with me. I'd convinced myself that I had every mental disorder there was. I'd convinced myself I was bipolar, I was manic depressive, I was borderline, I had all these things wrong with me. I'd go to the doctor and I'd tell the doctor what was wrong with me and what he needed to give me. I knew it all. I thought that, you don't know, mate. I know, because I'm living this hell, but, alcohol was never the problem. But I didn't realise that, if I took the alcohol away, half of these problems, or most of these problems will go away. I woke up one day, I don't know what day it was, because I was living alone. I couldn't even be trusted with the cat. The cat was bloody anorexic because I didn't feed it. And the cat got taken away as well. My parents came down and took the cat away. The cat lived down at Mum and Dad's for 9 months, and she got treated like a queen. She was probably needed to go to OA when she came home, because she was got treated so well. And, I was just in such a state. But I decided this day, it was really hot, stinking summer's day, and I'm sitting outside in my kids' wading pool, and I weighed about 48 kilos, and I'm drinking a bottle of vodka, and I downed a bottle of sleeping pills, and they didn't work. Nothing worked. And I thought I might give this AA another crack. But the problem was I never knew whether it was day or night or what day it was. But the only way I could tell was if I turned the TV on and, if sunrise was on, I knew it was the morning. And if the nightly news was on, I knew it was nighttime. That was the only way I could tell because we didn't have iPhones and stuff back then. So that was the only way I knew what time of the day it was, unless it was, pitch dark and it was nighttime. So I got in my car and I drove to a women's meeting, and then I continued to go to meetings, and I detoxed, and I, for the first 3 months I was off and on. Like I'd not drink during the week, and then I'd drink on the weekends, and I tried different things, and in the end I thought, no, this is not working, so I just continued to go to AA. And
this is the end of part 1 of Carissa's story. Tune in next time to listen to the second part.